There is one big question cruise passengers should be asking right now. How will cruising survive the Iran war? Because even if your ship is nowhere near Iran, this conflict could still hit cruises in ways most passengers are not thinking about yet. Oil prices have surged, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has been heavily disrupted, and travel companies are already feeling the pressure from rising fuel costs. And that matters for cruisers because when fuel gets more expensive, the effects can start spreading fast. Higher cruise fares, more expensive flights, possible itinerary changes, extra pressure on supply chains, and a growing risk that holidays people thought were locked in could suddenly cost more or change at the last minute. Reuters is already reporting real-world travel operators being hit by rising fuel costs, and airlines are moving into emergency cost-cutting mode because of the oil shock tied to the war. So in this video, we're going to look at what this war could really mean for cruise passengers, which parts of cruising are most at risk, whether fares could rise even more in 2026, and what cruise lines may have to do next if this crisis keeps dragging on. Because this may not just be another headline far away from your holiday, it could end up changing the cost of cruising, the routes ships take, and the future of the industry itself. Number 1. Fuel prices could hit cruise lines first. If there is one place where this war could slam the cruise industry first, it is fuel. Because cruise ships do not run on hope, headlines, or wishful thinking. They run on huge amounts of fuel, and when oil prices jump, cruise lines feel it fast. Right now, that pressure is very real. Reuters reported that oil forecasts for 2026 just saw their biggest jump on record after the Iran war disrupted supply through the Strait of Hormuz, a route that handles about 20% of the world's oil and LNG transport. Reuters also reported Brent crude rose about 59 to 60% in March, while Carnival cut its annual profit forecast after fuel costs surged. And this is where cruise passengers need to pay attention. A lot of people hear oil prices and think that only affects people filling up their car. But for cruise lines, fuel is one of the biggest operating costs they have. So, when the price of oil shoots up, it is not some distant business problem on a spreadsheet. It becomes a direct threat to how cheaply cruise lines can keep ships sailing, how much pressure they come under, and how long they can absorb those higher costs without passing some of that pain on to passengers. Carnival is already feeling that pressure hard enough that it lowered its profit outlook, even while bookings remained strong. And Carnival may just be the warning sign, because if one of the biggest cruise companies in the world is already getting hit by higher fuel costs, passengers should not assume the rest of the industry is somehow floating above all this untouched. Some cruise lines may be better protected than others, and some may have smarter ways of handling fuel risk, but none of them get to ignore a major oil shock if it keeps going. Reuters says the Strait of Hormuz disruption is a core reason analysts sharply raised oil forecasts, and that is the kind of thing that can keep pressure on the entire travel industry, not just one company. So when people ask, how will cruising survive the Iran war? This may be the first honest answer. It survives by trying to absorb the fuel shock for as long as it can. And if it cannot, then something else has to give. Maybe that means higher fares later. Maybe that means more cuts behind the scenes. Maybe that means cruise lines quietly reworking how they operate so passengers feel the squeeze without always knowing exactly why. But it usually starts here, with fuel. Because before a cruise line changes your itinerary, before it trims value, before it adds pressure somewhere else, it first has to deal with the raw cost of keeping that ship moving. And right now, that cost is under serious pressure from a war most cruisers probably thought had nothing to do with their holiday. Reuters and AP both report crude oil moved above $100 a barrel as the conflict disrupted global supply. That is what makes this so important. The first sign of trouble may not be some dramatic cancellation. It may just be the price of fuel. And once that starts climbing high enough, everything else in cruising can start changing after it. Number 2. Flights to the cruise port could get more expensive. A lot of cruise passengers focus on the ship, the cabin, the drink package, and the ports. But before any of that happens, most people still have to get to the cruise. And that is where this war could start hurting passengers in a way that feels very immediate. Because even if your cruise fare has not changed yet, the flight to your embarkation city could. Airlines are already being hit by the same fuel shock spreading through the travel industry. Reuters reported that Korean Air is moving into emergency mode because of soaring oil prices tied to the Iran war, and fuel surcharges on some major international routes are jumping by more than 200%. Reuters also reported that Cathay Pacific has already raised fuel surcharges again, while warning that long periods of high jet fuel costs could force changes to its plans. And that matters a lot for cruisers, because the cruise is only one part of the holiday. If someone is flying to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Barcelona, Sydney, Singapore, or anywhere else to meet their ship, the flight can become the first part of the trip that starts getting ugly. Suddenly, the cheap cruise does not feel so cheap anymore. You might still see a decent fare on the sailing itself, but then the airfare starts climbing, the surcharge gets added, and the whole trip begins to feel heavier on the wallet before you have even stepped on board. Reuters says global jet fuel prices nearly doubled after the conflict began, which helps explain why airlines are now under real pressure to raise surcharges, rethink fares, or cut capacity. And there is another problem here that cruise passengers sometimes forget. Flights are not just about cost. They are also about reliability. When airlines get squeezed, they do not just sit there and smile through it. They start looking at every lever they can pull. Reuters reported that airlines are weighing pricing and capacity decisions as fuel spikes threaten travel demand, while some carriers have already moved into cost-cutting mode, and others have warned their network plans may need to change if high fuel prices continue. So if this pressure drags on, passengers could end up dealing with more expensive seats, fewer convenient options, and a harder time lining flights up cleanly with cruise departures. And that is what makes this such a sneaky cruise problem. Because a lot of passengers will not blame the war at first. They will just notice that flights cost more than expected, or that the best flight times are gone, or that getting to the port now needs an extra stop, an overnight hotel, or a much bigger budget. Then, all of a sudden, the cruise itself has not changed much on paper, but the full cruise holiday has become more expensive and more stressful anyway. Reuters also reported that major Chinese airlines are turning cautious because fuel costs have more than doubled since the conflict began, which shows this is not just one airline or one country having a bad week. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this is part of the answer. The ship may still sail, but if the flight to the ship keeps getting pricier, harder to book, or less reliable, then the pressure reaches cruise passengers long before embarkation day. And for many people, that could be the first real sign that this war is affecting their holiday at all. Number 3. Cruise fares may not stay where they are now. This is the part a lot of passengers may not want to hear, because even if cruise lines do not raise prices straight away, that does not mean today's prices are safe. If fuel keeps climbing, and airlines, shipping companies, and travel businesses keep getting squeezed, cruise lines may eventually have to recover those costs somewhere. And that somewhere often ends up being the passenger. Reuters has already reported that Carnival cut its annual profit forecast because of higher fuel costs, even though bookings were still strong, which is a warning sign that cost pressure is already hitting one of the biggest names in cruising. And that is what makes this so important. A lot of people think cruise pricing only changes when demand changes. If ships are full, prices go up. If bookings are weak, prices come down. But real-world costs matter too. And when the cost of running ships rises sharply, cruise lines can only absorb that pain for so long before they have to start protecting their margins. Reuters also reported that 2026 oil price forecasts just saw their steepest jump on record after the Iran war disrupted supply through the Strait of Hormuz, which helps explain why travel companies are suddenly under so much pressure. So even if passengers do not see an obvious Iran war surcharge stamped onto their booking, the effect can still show up in quieter ways. Maybe the base fare starts inching up. Maybe the cheap deals become harder to find. Maybe the so-called bargain cruise still exists, but the better cabins climb faster, the add-ons get pricier, or the overall value is just not what it used to be. That is often how these things happen. Not always with one giant shock all at once, but with a series of smaller changes that slowly make the trip cost more than people expected. Reuters has already linked the conflict-driven fuel spike to mounting travel industry cost pressures beyond cruising alone. And this matters because cruising has built a lot of its appeal around the idea of value. People will often justify the holiday by saying, well, the meals are included, the entertainment is included, the room is included, and compared with a land holiday, it still feels like a good deal. But that whole value story gets harder to maintain if the cost of fuel stays high for long enough. Cruise lines may still try to look affordable on the surface, but behind the scenes, they may be reworking prices, trimming value, or pushing passengers towards spending more in other areas just to make the numbers work. Carnival's reduced profit outlook despite strong demand suggests exactly that kind of pressure is already building. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, one possible answer is this: it survives by charging more. Not always immediately, not always in the most obvious way, but if this crisis drags on, passengers should not assume cruise fares will just sit there unchanged while fuel costs keep hammering the industry. Because cruise lines are businesses, not charities, and if the pressure keeps building, some of that pressure usually finds its way back to the customer. That is why this matters now. The real warning sign may not be a canceled cruise. It may be that the same holiday quietly starts costing more than it did before. Number 4. Supply chains could start causing onboard changes. This is where the story starts getting more real for passengers. Because even if your cruise ship is nowhere near Iran, and even if your sailing is not canceled, that does not mean the war cannot still follow you on board in other ways. One of the biggest ripple effects of this conflict is what it can do to shipping and supply chains. Reuters has reported that the war has pushed up fuel costs, insurance costs, and storage costs for major shipping companies, with Hapag-Lloyd saying the crisis is adding roughly $40 million to $50 million a week in extra costs. Reuters also reported that Maersk has suspended cargo bookings to many Gulf ports and imposed emergency fuel surcharges globally as the disruption spreads through logistics networks. And that matters for cruise passengers more than people might think. Cruise ships are basically floating hotels, restaurants, bars, and entertainment venues all rolled into one. They need a constant stream of food, drinks, supplies, spare parts, cleaning products, and all the little things passengers barely notice unless something goes wrong. So, when the wider shipping system gets more expensive and less efficient, cruise lines can start feeling that pressure too. Reuters has also reported rerouted shipping around Africa is adding 10 to 14 days to some journeys and bringing extra surcharges of $1,500 to $4,000 per container, which shows how quickly transport costs can build when normal routes are disrupted. That does not necessarily mean passengers will walk on board and find empty shelves everywhere, but it could mean more subtle changes. Maybe some products cost more for the cruise line to source. Maybe certain items become harder to get on time. Maybe food and beverage costs rise. Maybe some things quietly disappear, get swapped out, or become more limited. Reuters reported that plastic and petrochemical prices have surged because the war disrupted flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and that companies in the US and Europe are already passing on higher costs to customers. That matters because cruise ships rely on huge volumes of packaged goods, hospitality supplies, and maintenance materials that all sit somewhere inside that broader supply chain. And this is the sneaky part. Passengers may not always connect those onboard changes back to a war. They may just notice that the menu feels a bit tighter, or that certain brands are missing, or that prices on board seem to creep up again, or that cruise lines become even more careful about what they include and what they charge extra for. That is partly an inference, but it follows naturally from the cost pressures Reuters is already reporting across shipping, fuel, and imported goods. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this is another honest answer. It may survive by adapting behind the scenes, by changing suppliers, by cutting back in areas passengers do not immediately see, by making small onboard adjustments that protect margins while trying not to make the holiday feel obviously worse. Because long before a cruise line announces some dramatic change, the quieter pressure often starts here, in the supply chain. And if that pressure keeps building, passengers may start noticing the effects not in the headlines, but in the everyday details of the cruise itself. Number 5. Some itineraries could quietly become less attractive. This is where the cruise starts changing in a way passengers might actually feel. Because even if the ship still sails, and even if your booking stays intact, the overall experience can still shift if cruise lines start adapting to higher costs and a more unstable travel picture. And that is why this matters. When fuel prices surge and supply chains get messier, cruise lines do not just sit there and hope for the best. They start looking at where they can reduce pressure, where they can run more efficiently, and which sailings make the most sense in a more expensive world. Reuters has reported that Brent crude surged about 60% in March as the war disrupted energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz, while Carnival has already cut its annual profit forecast because of higher fuel costs. So what could that mean for passengers? It could mean that some itineraries start looking a little less generous, a little less exciting, or a little less convenient than they used to. Maybe the route stays the same on paper, but the timing changes. Maybe port calls get tightened. Maybe shorter sailings start looking more attractive to cruise lines than longer ones because they are easier to run and easier to sell in a nervous market. That last part is an inference, but it follows from the cost pressure Reuters is already reporting across cruises, airlines, and shipping. And there is another layer to this. The wider shipping crisis is already pushing companies to reroute vessels, avoid riskier areas, and absorb longer transit times. Reuters reported that major carriers are avoiding the Suez Canal and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, rerouting around Africa instead, which adds 10 to 14 days on some journeys and brings extra surcharges of $1,500 to $4,000 per container. That matters because even if your cruise ship is not taking that exact path, the whole travel and logistics system around it is becoming more expensive and less simple. And when that happens, cruise lines may start favoring what feels safer and easier to manage. That could mean leaning harder into close-to-home sailings, drive-to ports, or itineraries that are simpler to operate if costs stay high and passengers start getting more cautious. Again, that is an inference, not a direct announcement from cruise lines, but it is a very logical one when you look at what is already happening across aviation, cargo shipping, and energy markets. Airlines are already moving into emergency cost mode, and global transport companies are passing on new surcharges. So the risk here is not always that cruises get canceled. It is that some cruises slowly become less appealing. Less value, less flexibility, less of that easy feeling people want when they book a holiday. The destination may still sound great, but if the route is trimmed, the timing is tighter, the travel costs are higher, and the whole thing feels more complicated, then the cruise has already changed even without some dramatic announcement. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this may be part of the answer. It survives by adjusting the product, by making certain itineraries simpler, safer, or cheaper to run. And for passengers, that could mean the cruise industry survives just fine. But the kind of cruising people loved may slowly start looking a bit different. Number 6. Red Sea and nearby regions stay a problem. This is the part where some passengers may start thinking, hold on, my cruise is not going anywhere near Iran, so why should I care? And that is fair. Because most mainstream cruisers are not booking a holiday expecting to sail anywhere near a war zone. But the problem is, this conflict does not stay neatly boxed in one place. It spreads pressure across the whole region, and that matters for cruising even when your own ship is nowhere near the fighting. Reuters reported that Yemen's Houthis said they were ready to join the Iran war if needed, which raises the risk of new attacks around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's key maritime choke points. That matters because the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb are already sensitive areas for global shipping, and any fresh escalation there adds even more instability to a region cruise lines and travel operators would much rather avoid. And that is what makes this such a stubborn problem. Because even before passengers see some obvious cruise headline, the wider shipping world is already reacting. Reuters reported that Maersk has suspended cargo bookings to many Gulf ports and imposed emergency fuel surcharges, while Hapag-Lloyd said the conflict was adding about $40 million to $50 million a week in extra costs. That tells you this is not some tiny distant issue with no real-world impact. Major transport companies are already being forced to change how they operate. For cruise passengers, that matters for two reasons. First, it keeps pressure on costs. If a whole region stays unstable, fuel, insurance, routing, and supply costs do not just magically settle down. And second, it keeps the travel industry nervous. Cruise lines do not like uncertainty. They like predictable routes, predictable costs, and passengers who feel confident booking ahead. A conflict that can pull in the Red Sea, the Gulf, and nearby shipping lanes makes all of that harder. And this is where the story gets more serious. The Guardian reported that the conflict has already disrupted Red Sea shipping lanes and widened fears of a prolonged regional crisis, while ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has slowed dramatically and crews have faced mounting safety fears. So even if a cruise ship never goes near the most dangerous areas, the wider message to travel companies is clear. This is not a stable part of the world right now. That does not automatically mean passengers should panic. But it does mean cruise lines may keep steering clear, stay cautious, and think twice about anything that exposes them to more regional risk than necessary. And when companies start thinking like that, Passengers can feel it later through route choices, pricing, or a more careful approach to certain parts of the world. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this is part of the answer. It survives by staying away from the most unstable pressure points, by watching the region carefully, and by making sure that even a distant war does not become a direct cruise crisis. Because the real danger is not always that cruise ships sail into trouble. Sometimes it is that the trouble hangs over the wider region long enough to change how the whole industry behaves. Number 7. Travel insurance nerves could grow. This is one of those problems that can start quietly. Because even if a cruise still sails, and even if the itinerary looks mostly normal, passengers can start getting nervous the moment a war begins affecting travel headlines, fuel prices, flight schedules, and shipping routes. And once that nervous feeling gets into the booking process, it can change how people plan their holiday. Reuters has reported that the Iran war has already sent oil prices surging, hit airlines with sharply higher fuel costs, and forced major shipping companies into emergency surcharges and route changes. That matters because the more unstable the wider travel picture becomes, the more passengers start wondering what happens if something changes after they book. And that is where travel insurance starts becoming a much bigger deal, because a lot of people book a cruise thinking mainly about weather, illness, or maybe a missed flight. But when a conflict starts rattling multiple parts of the travel industry at once, people begin thinking about a different set of worries. What if flights get disrupted? What if a port gets dropped? What if the cruise line changes the itinerary? What if the trip still goes ahead, but parts of it become more expensive, more stressful, or less predictable than expected? Those are exactly the kinds of fears that can make passengers more cautious, even before anything has directly gone wrong. And the truth is, fear alone can affect booking behavior. Passengers do not always need an actual cancellation to start second-guessing a trip. Sometimes all it takes is weeks of headlines about war, shipping disruption, rising oil, and aviation pressure. Reuters reported that airlines are already facing a fare dilemma as the fuel spike threatens travel demand, which shows the concern is not just about cost on paper. It is about people becoming more hesitant to book when the whole travel environment feels shakier. For cruise lines, that creates another challenge. Because even if they are doing everything they can to keep ships running normally, they are still operating in a world where passengers may feel less secure about spending thousands on a holiday that suddenly feels less certain than it did a few weeks ago. And if more travelers start thinking, maybe I should wait, maybe I should insure everything, maybe I should not risk that longer or more complicated cruise right now, then the war is already influencing the cruise market without touching the ship itself. And this is why this point matters. The danger is not only what the war physically changes, it is also what it changes in people's minds. Because cruising depends heavily on confidence. People book early, plan months ahead, and hand over a lot of money before the holiday even begins. If confidence drops, even a little, that can ripple through the industry just as surely as a fuel spike can. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this is part of the answer. It has to survive not just the practical disruption, but the emotional one too. Because once passengers start worrying more about what could go wrong, travel insurance becomes a bigger issue. Booking confidence gets shakier, and the cruise industry has one more problem to manage in a crisis that is already affecting far more than just one part of the world. Number 8. Cruise lines may start cutting in ways passengers notice. This is the part passengers usually feel last, but remember longest. Because when costs rise, cruise lines do not always come straight out and say, "Sorry, this war is making everything harder, so here is exactly what we are changing." More often, the pressure shows up in smaller ways first. Quiet ways. The kind of changes people notice on board, but cannot always immediately explain. And that is what makes this important. Reuters has already reported that higher fuel costs tied to the Iran war have forced Carnival to cut its annual profit forecast, while airlines and shipping companies are also moving into emergency cost mode and adding surcharges. That matters because when big travel companies start getting squeezed from multiple sides, they usually start looking for ways to protect margins wherever they can. For cruise lines, that can mean passengers start seeing the squeeze in everyday parts of the holiday. Maybe it is not some huge dramatic downgrade at first. Maybe it is just fewer little extras. Maybe prices on board creep up again. Maybe something that used to feel included now feels a bit more limited. Maybe there is more aggressive upselling, more pressure to spend, or more areas where the value just does not feel quite as generous as it used to. That is an inference, but it is a very realistic one when fuel, shipping, and travel costs are all rising at once. And passengers usually do notice, because people can forgive a lot when a cruise still feels fun, relaxing, and worth the money. But when the cost of the holiday is already rising, and then the onboard experience starts feeling tighter too, that is when frustration builds. People start thinking, hold on, I paid more to get here. I paid more for the cruise, and now it feels like I am getting nudged to spend even more once I am on board. That is the danger for cruise lines. Because surviving a crisis is one thing. Making passengers feel good about what survival looks like is something else entirely, and that is why this point matters so much. Cruise lines may be able to handle fuel shocks and supply pressure on paper, but if the way they handle it ends up being obvious to passengers in the form of cuts, extra charges, or a less generous onboard experience, then the war starts affecting not just the business side of cruising, but the actual feeling of the holiday itself. Reuters has already shown that companies across travel and shipping are being forced to pass on costs and rethink operations because of the conflict-driven oil shock. So when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this may be one of the most honest answers. It may survive by giving passengers a little less and charging them a little more. Not always in a way that is obvious at first. But in a way, people will definitely start noticing if the pressure keeps building. Because sometimes the biggest sign of a crisis is not that the holiday disappears. It is that the holiday still exists, but feels a little more expensive, a little more restricted, and a little less generous than before. Number 9. The real danger may be a cruise holiday becoming harder to afford. This may be the biggest threat of all. Not that cruising suddenly disappears, not that every ship stops sailing, but that the average passenger slowly gets priced out of the kind of cruise holiday that once felt doable. Because when people hear about war affecting travel, they often picture something dramatic. Canceled routes, dangerous regions, big headlines. But sometimes the real damage happens more quietly than that. It happens when one extra cost gets piled on top of another, then another, then another, until the holiday that used to feel exciting starts feeling too expensive to justify. And that is where this could be heading. Reuters has already reported that the Iran war has driven a huge jump in oil prices and forced travel operators, airlines, and shipping companies to deal with sharply higher fuel costs, surcharges, and operational pressure. Carnival has already cut its annual profit forecast because of fuel costs, while airlines have moved into emergency cost mode and raised fuel surcharges on major routes. And for cruisers, that adds up fast. Maybe the cruise fare itself rises a bit. Then, the flights to the port cost more. Then, hotels before the cruise feel pricier. Then, insurance starts looking more important. Then, spending on board feels tighter too. And all of a sudden, the holiday has not collapsed, but the full cost of taking it has started creeping beyond what many people feel comfortable paying. That is why this matters, because cruising has always sold itself as a kind of escape. A holiday where a lot is wrapped into one package, where the value feels easier to justify, and where ordinary people can still feel like they are getting something special. But if war-driven costs keep spreading across fuel, flights, shipping, and travel confidence, that value equation starts getting weaker. And this is the part cruise lines should worry about most. Passengers can handle bad news. They can handle route changes. They can even handle paying a bit more if they feel the holiday is still worth it. But when the total trip starts feeling too expensive from every angle, that is when people delay booking, downgrade what they choose, or decide not to go at all. Reuters has already reported that airlines are facing a fare dilemma because high fuel prices are threatening travel demand, and the same basic pressure can spill into cruising too. So, when people ask how cruising survives the Iran war, this may be the most uncomfortable answer. It may survive as an industry, but the holiday itself could become harder for everyday people to afford. And if that happens, then the real loss is not that cruising ends. It is that cruising slowly becomes something fewer people can comfortably reach. Because sometimes a travel crisis does not kill the holiday. It just prices more people out of it. Number 10. Cruise lines will probably survive, but cruising could change. So after all of this, here is the answer a lot of people may not expect. Cruise lines will probably survive. But that does not mean cruising comes through this unchanged, because industries like cruising do not usually collapse the moment a crisis hits. They adapt. They adjust. They find ways to keep going. And that is exactly why this story matters. The real question is not whether cruise ships will suddenly stop existing. It is what cruise lines may have to do to keep the business alive if this war keeps pushing up fuel costs, flight costs, shipping costs, and pressure across the wider travel industry. Reuters has already reported that oil forecasts for 2026 saw their steepest jump on record after the Iran war disrupted flows through the Strait of Hormuz, while Carnival has cut its annual profit forecast because of higher fuel costs. And that gives us the clearest answer to the title of this video. How will cruising survive the Iran war? Most likely by passing through the pressure rather than escaping it. That could mean higher fares. It could mean fewer generous extras. It could mean more strategic itineraries, tighter operating decisions, more charges, and a cruise experience that feels a little less carefree than it once did. Some of that is inference, but it follows directly from the cost pressures already hitting cruises, airlines, and shipping companies at the same time. Reuters has also reported airlines moving into emergency cost mode and shipping companies imposing surcharges and absorbing major extra weekly costs because of the conflict. And that is the part passengers need to understand. Cruising is a business before it is a holiday. So, if the pressure keeps building, cruise lines are not just going to sit there and absorb endless pain out of kindness. They will protect routes. They will protect margins. They will protect demand as best they can. And if passengers end up paying more, getting a little less, or seeing a different style of cruise product emerge, that may be the price of survival. That does not mean panic is the right response. It just means people should be realistic. Because the most likely outcome here is not that cruising disappears. It is that cruising changes slowly enough that people only fully notice once the value feels different, the fares feel heavier, and the holiday no longer feels quite as easy as it used to. Reuters reporting on the fuel shock, airline pricing pressure, and shipping disruption all point in that direction. So in the end, yes, cruising will probably survive. But it may survive by becoming more expensive, more cautious, and more complicated than many passengers were used to. And that may be the real impact of this war. Not that cruising ends, but that the version people loved has to change in order to keep going. A strong final closing line would be, so maybe the better question is not how will cruising survive the Iran war? Maybe it is this: what will cruising look like by the time it does?